What we might call the Thermidorian consensus, that Robespierre and his allies had to die, collapsed before the man's body was even cold. On the afternoon of 10 Thermidor, as the bodies of the Robespierristes were unceremoniously dumped in a mass grave, Bertrand Barrère delivered a speech to the convention. He assured them that the National Convention remained supreme, that the committees of public safety and general security would now take a back seat. He was, of course, lying through his teeth. The three institutions which had brought Robespierre down all had competing ideas for what came next. But of course it's not that easy, because within each institution were factions with their own competing visions. The National Convention certainly had the authority to assume control in the power vacuum obvious to all, but public safety was still dominant, and general security, having pulled through at a critical juncture, expected their just desserts. The question of who would take the reins bled into the Thermidorians' response to remnant Robespierristes. To begin, they gutted the Paris Commune in a massive police strike coordinated by General Security that saw 70 communards arrested on 11 Thermidor. And just as it happened the day before, they were all processed under the law of 22 Prairial. No trial, no appeal, straight to the guillotine. There was even talk of razing the Hôtel de Ville, which Freron called the palace of the tyrant Robespierre. The mass execution was the tribunal's largest in a single day, which is ironic since they were on the chopping block too. Again, on 10 Thermidor, a delegate of the Plain successfully passed a proposal calling for a purge of the Revolutionary Tribunal. The convention had the committees assess this option. General Security mulled the question over during the night, so too did Public Safety. The next day, an ally of General Security forwarded to the convention their proposal for the complete abolition of the tribunal. General Security would assume their functions. In the long and adversarial relationship between the two, such a demand is not surprising. Public Safety wasn't having it though, and Billaud Varennes jumped to the tribunal's defense, which put him in the unenviable position of having to justify the continued existence of an organization which was inextricably associated with the Terror. After much debate, the issue was again referred to the committees to hash out internally. This conflict over the fate of the tribunal, literally only a day after the Thermidorian coup, was representative of the fundamental question now facing every public figure and politician in Paris. Should the revolution continue? At this early stage, Billaud Varennes and Barrère prodded Public Safety toward overt support for the revolution. General Security were not ideologically opposed to the revolution, but they did oppose public safety. And in this, they were joined by the Thermidorian majority in the convention. This majority now wished to pump the brakes for two reasons. Moderates abhorred the Terror and wanted it to end, and conservatives thought all the blood had been squeezed from the stone and now wished to consolidate the revolution's gains. And this moderate conservative bloc was pretty immovable. When Barrère came back on 12 Thermidor with a list of tribunal judges and jurors to be purged, the convention assented, but on the condition that they weigh in on replacements to public safety. Because Barrère also had 3 blokes he wanted to join the committee, and the convention weren't fans. Instead of signing off on these names, as had happened for the past year, the convention put it to a vote. The debate raged for days and grew extremely tense, like guys throwing things across the Tuileries Theatre. Denuded of Robespierre's raw strength, public safety was no match for the increasingly assertive convention, especially delegates like Tallien, Freron, and Dubois-Croncet. The latter came forth to propose rotating the committee's members every few years, and preventing them from going on mission for too long. As it was, Prieur de Haut and Jean Bon had been on mission since 1793, and so were effectively unaccountable to the convention. Public safety's refusal to be governed inspired a fear in the convention that tyranny was not yet at an end. These fears were aptly expressed by Tallien, who feared that they had exchanged a triumvirate for a decemvirate. Public safety, just like the tribunal, was of Robespierre's design. Its continued existence, aloof from the convention, was intolerable. It's here that Joseph Cambon came forth to propose a devolution of the committee's power. He wanted 12 new committees established to assume the functions of public safety, with the convention controlling the management, agenda and operations of each. So do we have a conclusion on our hands? Not quite. Bourdon Lahoz voiced his concern that such a rash decision might interrupt committee business at a critical time. He gained some support for the matter to be deferred by 3 days. Tallien opposed this, and so too did Barrère, who overestimated his strength. He was no Robespierre. By the end of the session, the convention refused to ratify Barrère's list. The convention's refusal to support Barrère functioned something like a vote of no confidence. The following day, 14 Thermidor, the convention adopted a proposal stripping public safety of all their independent power and privileges. Every month, the committee would be regenerated, with 3 or 4 new members appointed, and these appointees would be vetted by the convention. General security was similarly affected. Public safety lost the right to appoint their members. In vain did Barrère try to prevent the passing of this proposal by claiming that public safety was only tyrannical when wielded by Robespierre. But none of the convention bought it, and they just ignored the committee right throughout the rest of July and into August. The Ventos laws were axed. So unused two committees, which had barely got off the ground, while their leaders were arrested and without direction, the committees withered and died. On 14 Thermidor, the law of 22 Prairial was repealed, thereby neutralising public safety's only real weapon. Likewise, the tribunal was defanged by the immediate arrest of Tinville and Herman. Both were accused of being Robespierrists, an incredulous claim, considering how instrumental Tinville had been in making Robespierre's execution legal. The Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris was suspended, along with the other two out in Flanders. But that did not mean that persecution was at an end. Other Robespierrists, or more accurately supposed Robespierrists, were soon arrested en masse. Lebas of General Security was arrested and attempted suicide in jail. A convention proxy named André Dumont took his place and used it to denounce Jacques-Louis David. Having aided Robespierre closely for over a year, David would have gone to the guillotine if he weren't so damn talented. Fortunately for him, he'd abandoned Robespierre at the end, and so escaped punishment. But his political fortunes never recovered. As if to mark this decline, his painting, The Death of Marat, was removed from its place in the Tuileries Theatre and left to collect dust. With the Robespierrists absolutely finished, surviving Dantonists came out of the woodwork. They were the ones spearheading the purging and execution of the Robespierrists, for obvious political and personal reasons. With their resurgence as a political force, anti-terror moderation was back on the table. A general amnesty was declared after a petition from the Section Montmartre, which drew attention to the plight of their fellows who had been falsely imprisoned for 5 months. Moved, the convention threw the prisons open, despite vociferous protest from Barrère and the committees. Barrère was particularly aggrieved that nobles and clergymen might be let go, fearing that they would stir up trouble. But amnesty was popular, and Parisians of all stripes converged on the prisons to offer the released congratulations and presents. When they heard of public safety's reticence, mobs surrounded the homes of the members. In late August, public safety was finally given its death blow. Cambon's proposal was adopted as the Law of Seven Fructidor. Public safety's executive functions were completely taken over by the convention. Only military procurement and strategy, as well as diplomatic missions, remained under their jurisdiction. No more arrests, no more hiring and firing, no more unchecked control. All of their other functions would be assumed by 12 new committees, some of which were amalgamations of existing organs. And though they were all still technically subordinated to public safety, each had free rein in their own wheelhouse. Public safety couldn't dictate inflationary policy to the Committee of Finance, for example. Of course, this was a great boon for General Security, who were now independent, and they also benefited from an immediate expansion of their funding and functions. But they were still under the convention's thumb due to the pressure exerted by the new Committee of Legislation. This committee would be better called the Committee of Justice, as they were in charge of the courts and the police. While the Law of Seven Fructidor confirmed the convention's place, it did so by devolving powers to a significant degree. This meant that revolutionary legislation became effectively impossible to implement. A single committee now no longer had the capacity, much less the authority, to push their own agenda. Everything now ran by the convention, and they weren't going to let anything revolutionary pass. This shift came into stark relief by mid-Thermidor. The convention was united in their belief that the prisons ought to be opened, but Thermidorians were still concerned with the rapid pace. Nearly 500 prisoners were released in only 5 days, and many of them were Robespierrists. They were released on the condition that they be loyal to the new regime, but pretty quickly these conditions were ignored. Many Thermidorians, like Legendre and Lahoz, were attacked for having signed off on the imprisonment of so many people in the first place. The Montagnards were quick to make political hay. On 20 Thermidor, one of their members put forth a motion calling for a renewed revolutionary tribunal. It would do 2 things. Firstly, impose restrictions on the length and scope of judicial proceedings, and 2, see several Montagnards be given powerful new positions. While the Thermidorians came together to quash the most objectionable parts of this proposal, the Montagnards remained defiant, continuing to push for a general amnesty. All of this came to a head at the session of 26 Thermidor. Fierce debates broke out over the fate of several former nobles, including General Kellerman. The Thermidorians were okay with these guys being let go, knowing that to keep them would be deeply unpopular, but this opened them up to criticism from the left for protecting aristocrats. At this, Tallien launched into a defense of the Thermidorian approach. What we want is that innocence should no longer be oppressed, that the sword of justice should no longer be double-edged. I sincerely admit that I would rather see 20 aristocrats set at liberty today and be re-arrested tomorrow than see a single patriot left in chains. Is the Republic, with its 1.2 million citizens under arms, to be afraid of a few aristocrats? The Montagnard tried in vain to get a proposal passed that would see the names of the released and their guarantors made public. This would put the names of numerous Thermidorians alongside those of aristocrats and traitors. So the Thermidorians countered, arguing instead that the names of those who arrested them in the first place should be published, something that would injure the Montagnard. By session's end, the Thermidorians were triumphant, with no list ever being printed. The fateful session of 26 Thermidor broke the Thermidorian consensus by driving a wedge between the political left and the political centre, a centre which now took a sharp turn to the right. While the Montagnard still wanted the revolution to continue, chiefly through the continued persecution of counter-revolutionaries, the Thermidorians were willing to make a grand compromise, to end the revolution if it meant a general peace. That meant that the terror had to officially end. On 2 Fructidor, the Thermidorians denounced the terror as a tool of Robespierreism. A return to tyranny was right around the corner, so long as it remained active. Debate raged for several days until Tallien clinched the win on 11 Fructidor. Not only was the terror deeply unpopular, he claimed, but also counterproductive. The seeds of another civil war were sown if the Republic continued its persecution of suspects, many of whom were deemed guilty merely through association. Tallien had this to say: "The convention should no longer suffer the Republic to be divided into 2 classes, those who fear and those who are feared, the oppressor and the oppressed." Common Parisians were wary of these arguments. They could get behind ideas of amnesty for their lot, but still despised nobles and traitors. More well-to-do elements, however, were more than willing to bury the hatchet. Middle and upper-class interests aligned with the Thermidorians in calling for political peace. Strengthening this bond was Dubras-Croncet, who posited that economic revival would only be possible if a lasting peace was established. In one fell swoop, political conservatives and economic liberals aligned to slam the door shut on the revolution. Economic liberalism was back in vogue, and the Thermidorians plotted a course towards stability and order. And it's here that the reaction really kicks into high gear, as any laws or institutions associated with Robespierre were either annihilated or reformed. There was little continuation in domestic policy. Of course, the people weren't too pleased about all this. The final few bits of the maximum were repealed, and price gouging ramped up. Public welfare programs started by the Robespierreists were either ended or privatised. And as this was going on, the coming winter appeared to be a particularly cold one. The harvest of 1795 would be poor. Needless to say, popular discontent was building, and fears of a journée reawakened. Even so, the National Guard was firmly under Thermidorian control, and they later took direct control of the army away from public safety. The post of guard captain was also abolished, replaced by a rotation of 5 loyal officers who exercised joint command. It was with the implied threat of force that the Thermidorians decimated the institutional backbone of the sans-culottes. On August 16th, the hollowed-out husk of the Paris Commune was killed off. Control of the capital was effectively given over to a working coalition of general security backed up by the National Guard. The sectional assemblies remained, albeit greatly diminished. By convention decree, they were only permitted to meet every 10 days, and even then, only in the middle of the week, when their members were at work. Moreover, the living wage of 40 sous per week they paid out to sans-culottes was made illegal. This caused immediate divisions between the sans-culottes and their former paymasters, divisions which left the 48 sections powerless, as they were legislated out of existence. In their place would be 12 arrondissements, basically suburbs of Paris. The assemblies of these new administrative units would be appointed directly by the convention, and overseen by the committees. Montagnard protested this anti-democratic turn, and at least wanted the assembly positions to be elected officers. But the Thermidorians were adamant, with Cambon making the point that the army was not democratic, and yet it supported the government. Perhaps the Thermidorians ought to have not been so bolshy. Eliminating the sections forced hundreds of thousands of Parisians out of their existing societies without providing an organic alternative. Disaffected sans-culottes took to the streets in droves, and when combined with economic dislocation wrought by a return to economic liberalism, it turned out that the Thermidorians had a recipe for disaster on their hands. Though the sans-culottes posed a very credible threat, the Thermidorians found themselves greatly aided by a new ally. The Thermidorian alliance with the propertied middle and upper classes gave rise to a new breed of street fighter, the Jeunesse Dorée, the Golden Youth. Where the Girondin Moscadins were a mirror of the sans-culottes, as artisans, shopkeepers, journalists and clerks, the Jeunesse Dorée couldn't look more different. They were generally young men and women of wealth and education. They were decked out in tailored clothes, wore their hair long, and covered themselves in black, mourning the late king. Each carried a short club weighted with lead, meant for cracking skulls. Violence was frequent and bloody, with Golden Youth gangs prowling the streets, singling out the red caps and drapes of the sans-culottes. Such clashes were incredibly one-sided. The Thermidorian authorities were keen to shield their club-wielding foot soldiers. The Jacobins, by contrast, could offer no help to the sans-culottes. Since 10 Thermidor, the actual Jacobin club headquarters was blockaded by the Golden Youth, and the club prevented from meeting. Members were attacked on sight, others lived in constant fear. Unsurprisingly, members abandoned ship and donations dried up. The taint of Jacobinism marred a number of influential delegates, even those like Tallien and Fréron, who were estranged from the club. Both found themselves politically becalmed, despised by the Jacobins for their role in Thermidor, and then censured by the convention on 17 Fructidor. There yet remained a few Jacobins who pushed for revolutionary legislation, Barrère making a go of it in September. But these sorts of plans were doomed from the beginning, as by now the committees were cleansed of Jacobins, and all those who even tangentially bore the taint of Jacobinism. These included the Thermidorians among public safety and general security. Relations with the convention being as poor as they were, the futures for our committee men looked pretty dismal, and were made even worse by an unexpected disaster. The first regeneration of the committees was due to take place in late August, but a few days before, an ammunition factory in central Paris exploded, killing 400 people and starting a huge fire. Fortunately, the situation was quickly dealt with, but that it had happened at all shocked the convention. Consequently, at the regeneration, they not only secured the appointment of 4 loyal Thermidorians, but Carnot, Barrère, Billard Varenne and D'Herbois all retired. The Prieurs would return after October as loyal Thermidorians, along with Carnot, who is considered both capable and pliant. Disconnected from the committee, the Jacobins tried to rekindle their alliance with the sans-culottes, proposing all manner of populist economic policies, such as the redistribution of land to peasants and soldiers. Of course, these plans were rejected one by one. Billard Varenne then pivoted the Montagnards into a denunciation of the Thermidorians, who had scored appointments, and who were growing suspiciously rich. Only obliquely was he talking of Tallien, but it was enough for someone somewhere to get the wrong idea. On the night of 23 Fructidor, Tallien was shot and stabbed. His injuries were not too bad, but the assassination attempt was nonetheless all the excuse the Thermidorians needed to go one step further than denouncing the Jacobins, and instead call for their destruction. For days the political mudslinging ensued, with Barrère, as ever, trying to play mediator. He claimed that this sort of infighting gave excellent cover to aristocratic plots, but these appeals went nowhere. Indeed, the Thermidorians instead issued a series of decrees that kneecapped the Jacobins. Not only were all their papers and pamphlets shut down, but a number of Jacobins from regional clubs were ejected from Paris. These departmental clubs were still quite influential, and should a factional civil war break out between the Montagnards and the Thermidorians, it would be these regional clubs which would rally the left wing. So the Thermidorians ordered administrators to suppress the clubs. In droves did the less committed Jacobins depart, permanently crippling the club's influence outside of Paris. There was still a chance that the Jacobins might survive, but only if they were sated with becoming what was essentially an opposition party, the Montagnards sitting complacent as the left wing of the convention. Lindet, who had been reconciled with the Thermidorians, argued for just such a compromise. The Montagnards agreed to his terms, but in so doing, alienated the few remaining supporters they had among the sans-culottes and the regional Jacobin clubs. The Thermidorians didn't let this opportunity pass them by. An incident in Marseille provided excellent pretext. The Jacobin club there was stirring up trouble. Local representatives on mission, loyal to the convention, arrested the club's leaders and purged its radical members. Thermidorians seized upon the incident to claim that the Paris club was inciting revolts. By the beginning of October, the Thermidorians had secured control of the Committee of General Security and used their police to crack down on the Jacobins. Over the next few days, dozens were arrested, and leading Jacobins brought to trial. The most important of these cases was that of Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Not only was Carrier a staunch enemy of Tallien and Fréron, but he represented a tangible link to the Terror. You may recall Carrier's ordering of mass executions by drowning when a representative on mission to Nantes. Well, he was on the hook for it now. On September 8th, the 94 surviving prisoners Carrier had ordered arrested way back in January were finally brought to trial. It was a media sensation, and the defense argued that though the prisoners had been rebels, they understood the error of their ways and had rallied to the government's side. Not only had many of them died in prison in squalid conditions, but they claimed Carrier ordered them drowned. Carrier was summoned to the stand technically as a witness for the prosecution, but he ended up having to defend his conduct. A number of his colleagues ran the Nuremberg defense, while Carrier himself stated repeatedly that he'd focused exclusively on administrative affairs. After a week, the Nantes prisoners were acquitted, as sights were now set on Carrier. Inadvisably, some Jacobins launched into a passionate defense of Carrier, claiming that he and others like him were instrumental in pacifying the Vendée. The majority, however, didn't want to go out on a limb for Carrier, and they were right to suspect danger. Carrier's defenders tried to rally the sections to their side. Though these efforts were disappointing failures, the Golden Youth still acted upon this perceived threat, and raided the Jacobin Club during their session of the 9th of November. The militants broke up the session and busted a few skulls for good measure. Blame for the disorder was pinned on the Jacobins themselves, and so public safety forbade the meeting of the Jacobin Club. This was officially confirmed on 22 Brumaire, with the decree permanently closing the Jacobin Club in Paris. Carrier, meanwhile, had been arrested on the 11th of November. His trial began a few days later. For a month, every paper and pamphlet eviscerated Carrier. One, Gracchus Babeuf, tried his hand, and forwarded a conspiracy theory that Robespierre and Carrier had colluded to depopulate France. The Thermidorians used this chance to try and lump in a number of other former Jacobins. Carnot, Billaud Varenne and Barrère, all these guys were briefly investigated. But in the end, Carrier bore the brunt. Damning testimony from the Nantes prisoners ensured a guilty verdict. On December 16th, Carrier and 2 others were guillotined. This outcome is not terribly important, but what is important is just how bad it was for the Jacobins. Their credibility as friends of the people was absolutely shattered. After the trial of Carrier, there was not a section in Paris that was willing to stick their necks out for the bloody-minded minions of Robespierre, even if they still could. With the Jacobins finished, the Montagnards remaining in the convention were fatally undermined. Not only had dozens of their members been arrested, executed or deposed, but more moderate elements had made a ready cause with the Thermidorians. And as those who remained were the most committed partisans of the political left, they are fittingly called the Crest, as in the crest of a mountain. Through his paper, Les Auditeurs, Fréron was the most trenchant opponent of the Crest, and denounced them at every turn. He was also the one coordinating with the Golden Youth, feeding them information about where members of the Crest might be hiding. Though the Crest were horribly outmatched, one among them came into his own as a forceful defender of Jacobinism. François-Noël Babeuf was born in 1760, and though himself of common stock, was intimately familiar with the lower rungs of the feudal aristocracy. This is because he was a former tax collector and land appraiser, helping nobles squeeze all that could be squeezed from their tenants, particularly middle-class types. Supposedly, this proximity to the hardships endured by the common people inspired in Babeuf a righteous anger, which he channeled into revolutionary agitation. What seems more plausible is that after being sentenced to 20 years in prison for a scandal involving the forgery of sensitive documents, for which Babeuf was only partly to blame, he fled to Paris and from there became a revolutionary. For a few months, Babeuf couch-surfed until cornered by the authorities and imprisoned. He was only released with the Thermidorian amnesty. Once freed, Babeuf tried his hand at journalism by founding his own paper, the Journal for the Freedom of the Press, which was subsidized by the Thermidorians. They expected Babeuf to simply be one in a chorus denouncing the Terror and Robespierre, which Babeuf did do, but his real cause was, no surprise, freedom of the press. This ran him afoul of his Thermidorian donors, who were enforcing very strict censorship laws. In defending free speech, Babeuf had a friend in Baudson, who was a leader of one of the arrondissement assemblies. Baudson was in hot water after petitioning the convention to protect free speech. Babeuf offered what aid he could, despite the scrutiny of the authorities. This scrutiny was tough on Babeuf, forcing him, his wife and 3 children into poverty. He grew convinced that extensive social and welfare programs, as well as a pure democracy, were the promises of the revolution. And these promises, Babeuf controversially claimed, were those made by the Jacobins. He was quick to repudiate the Terror, Robespierre and the Tribunal, all that stuff, which saw him harassed by the Jacobin Club. But when the club was gone, he tried to rehabilitate the idea of pure Jacobinism that was hyper-democratic and egalitarian. This defense of Jacobinism was about the only hope the Crest had of surviving as a credible political movement. Of course, this annulled Babeuf's effective alliance with Tallien and Fréron, with whom he had been quite chummy, but the disdain was mutual. Tallien and Fréron spoke out against welfare and laws against speculation. Sensing that the political winds were drifting to the right, Babeuf refused to follow, and instead doubled down on his populist and democratic rhetoric. Alluding to antiquity, Babeuf restyled himself Gracchus Babeuf, in reference to the two Gracchi brothers, who were tribunes of the plebs and opponents of the patricians. In this populist vein, Babeuf seized upon the Constitution of 1793 as the centrepiece for a new Jacobin program. While the Thermidorians had been quick to, at the time, use the promise of a constitution to galvanise support, they had zero intention of actually putting it into practice. Simply put, they were already in total control, and the constitution threatened to devolve some of their powers back to public safety. It would also require elections, which as ever, the politicians weren't too keen to gamble on. Finally, the constitution would reinstate civil rights for all citizens, something that would make continued permissible persecution of the left wing just a little bit illegal. Of course, these were the exact things Babeuf wanted: civil rights, elections based on universal suffrage, separation of powers. These arguments Babeuf made all throughout October, when his paper was renamed the Tribune. For one particularly damning screed, he was arrested on the 24th. This was meant as a warning, which Babeuf deliberately ignored. At the closing of the Jacobin Club, he lamented this quote retrograde moment, which he compared in its reactionary nature to the Ancien regime. This was an apt comparison. Most of the Thermidorians were in bed with former nobles, in more ways than one. Not only did several start business deals and develop political ties with former nobles, but they married the daughters of rich families. Babeuf warned of the Pompadours, the Dubarrys, the Antoinettes. The Thermidorians spent November and December putting the screws into the crest. They opened December with a series of amnesties, first for Vendée rebels who laid down their arms, and then surviving Girondins, nearly 80 of whom were reinstated to the convention with much fanfare. This injection of some justifiably furious Girondins accelerated the pace of reaction. On December 23rd, the last vestiges of the maximum were repealed, and a few days later, a Girondin-led commission was founded to investigate former government employees. They also secured the release of all other Girondins, who in turn were restored to the convention. The crest hit back where they could, and claims of monarchism dogged the Girondins. But they were quick to display public support for regicide by signing onto Barrat's proposal that a celebration be held on January 21st, commemorating the second anniversary of Citizen Capet's execution. They then railed against the excesses of the Terror, knowing firsthand how the Jacobins treated their enemies. Confirming the resurgence of the Girondins was the fate of Marat. Marat had been, of course, an avowed Jacobin, but was nonetheless latched onto by the Thermidorians as a popular figure. In a symbolic move, they moved his remains to the Pantheon in September 1794. In February 1795, the Girondins gained support for disinterring Marat's remains. This was accompanied by the symbolic effacing of Marat through the destruction of his portraits and busts. Again, at Girondin urging, the convention placed under house arrest the thousands of ministers, agents and workers who had been ousted since 10 Thermidor. They were investigated by that Girondin commission, who returned on March 3rd to recommend the impeachment or expulsion of everybody who remained in government who was even tangentially related to the Jacobins. One of the few areas of continuation in policy centered on religion. Obviously, the cult of the Supreme Being was abolished, but its actual forms and days of celebration were all retained in an attempt to maintain an air of revolutionary continuity. Non-juring priests were still persecuted, and after September, no longer salaried employees of the state. As an outspoken critic of religion, Cambon was the Thermidorian chiefly responsible for such developments. It was his assertion that the separation of church and state, which had been a reality since 1790, was vital for the health of the Republic. There had been murmurs among the Thermidorians about relaxing restrictions on Catholics and implementing freedom of religion. Cambon feared that this would rehabilitate the Catholic clergy, who obviously had a bone to pick with the revolutionaries. He wanted control over the veneration of the revolution to be kept in the hands of trusted men, and in the temples of reason, which had replaced regular churches. For quite a while, the Thermidorians were on board, and adopted Cambon's zero-tolerance policy towards Catholicism. General Security oversaw the continued execution of priests who had never sworn the civic oath, and many were deported. Ironically, though Robespierre was gone, his ideas for inculcating revolutionary values in the citizenry through festivals and parades were not. All throughout France, there was a concerted effort by revolutionary authorities to develop the Republican civic religion. However, these efforts fell flat on their face. At least when Robespierre was shilling his cult, the people could afford to eat. Now they were bombarded with ridiculous religious overtures, as food was scarce and the assignat tanked yet again. As the popularity of the Thermidorians flatlined, their religious innovations floundered too. People sought the surety of traditional religion. The Abbé Grégoire was the first among many Thermidorians to propose easing restrictions on Catholic worship, drawing upon a wealth of historical precedent to support his position. As long as the clergy had sworn the civic oath, then the so-called constitutional church ought to be legitimized, he said. A similar case was being made by representatives on mission in the Vendée. They had been ordered to offer amnesties in exchange for peace, but the Chouans and the Vendéans refused to lay down their arms as long as Catholics were persecuted. Even so, the Thermidorians persisted in trying to enforce their anti-clerical laws, though by 1795, enforcement outside of Paris was effectively impossible. Churches were open, people returned to a 7-day week. Police sent to apprehend refractory priests instead helped them hide. Throwing in the towel, it took the Plain to propose what seemed at first like a nice middle ground. The law of 3 ventos meant that Catholicism would be tolerated but regulated. However, the Thermidorians didn't submit with grace, and the regulations were extremely strict. Catholicism was confined to discreet services. Nonetheless, the convention had given an inch, and that meant the Catholics could take a mile. Pretty soon, Catholicism was fully revitalized and on full public display. In mid-March, Grégoire issued a pamphlet calling for Catholics to take advantage of their newfound liberty. The groundswell of popular acclaim for this letter convinced the Thermidorians to let it slide when Catholics flaunted the law and began to organize and gather openly. The organic support enjoyed by the Catholics quickly gave them the cash and the backing needed to assert claims on their former churches. These were either rented or repurchased, as temples of reason closed up shop permanently. The cult of reason withered on the vine. There can be no religion without adherents. Mismanagement of the religious situation revealed just how profoundly unpopular the Thermidorians now were. After 6 months of governing, the Thermidorians could now no longer be judged in comparison to the regime they'd replaced. They could only be judged on their own merits and were found lacking. Between deregulation, the suppression of popular societies, and the persecution of Catholics, there was no love lost between the Thermidorians and the people for whom they professed to govern. The more damning indictment of the Thermidorians, however, is to be found in their consistent mishandling of political alliances. There were numerous factions who had lent their support to the broad anti-Robespierrist coalition which had destroyed the Jacobins at 10 Thermidor. And immediately afterwards, the Thermidorians had ingratiated themselves to the factions like the clergy and the Girondins, who were more than eager to see Robespierre dead. But the Thermidorian descent into reaction had imperiled these ties. They waited too long to free the Girondins. They made no friends among the priests by suppressing Catholics. These errors would now come to haunt the Thermidorians in the month of Germinal, when the dreaded Journée finally belatedly struck.